Okay, wait, I think people are still coming in.
Gotta be, that's, you know.
Okay. Okay, Liz, we can go.
I brought you to a slough within the Fakahatchee Strand because it is kind of like going back in time. Some of these trees could be several hundred years old.
It's important to me to help people who visit the Everglades understand and connect with the Everglades, but not only that, to also understand my culture as a Miccosukee Indian.
When he's moving around, I give him all the room he needs. This is their territory. This is their home.
It turns out the algae down there producing a neurotoxin that is evidence that can lead to neurodegenerative diseases. And this ends up in the shrimp and fish and so on. People are eating these things, but you can't see the toxin, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. You're completely unaware of that toxin. It doesn't cause any short-term health problems.
We are visiting a red-shouldered hawk nest that has two 2-week-old chicks in it. One of the questions we're asking with this project is whether we're watching extinction happen.
Okay, Tom, you're on.
Okay, welcome to this event in the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, SWAMPSCAPES with Liz Miller. I'm Tom Chevry, who along with Patty Zimmerman are the co-directors of FLEFF. Last year at this time, we ended our Embodied Festival and ran 3 online exhibitions. Actually, the first thing that we stopped was the VR event that Liz Miller, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, was going to come down to do, because I told Patty, I don't know if you can use goggles when we're in the midst of a pandemic. So it is just about a year since this happened. This year, we're 99% virtual, but there is one embodied event, and this is it. Because I have students here, some of the students in my class, it's a hybrid class, and so we have, you know, some embodied festival left. A lot's happened in the last year. You know, COVID, Black Lives Matter, the 2019 election, the attack on the US Capitol, vaccinations now, maybe a light at the end of the tunnel. So today, before I introduce Liz, let me just say that I'm going to give a brief introduction, but there will be more information, a longer bio about Liz in the chat, so keep your eye open for that. And there'll be other things posted in the chat as well, so that you can sort of dig into some of these issues a little bit more deeply. So having said that, let me just introduce Liz Miller. Liz is a longtime FLEFF collaborator and a friend of FLEFF. I think, Liz, you had a project on immigration in Montreal when you first came here. And then, of course, we did The Waterfront, which was your film about the water crisis in, it wasn't Flint, but it was near Detroit. So you've been a part of FLEFF for a long time. Liz, I should say, is a professor of communication studies at Concordia University. She is a maker and a professor interested in the new approaches of community collaborations and documentary as a way to connect personal stories to larger social concerns. Years of experience in community media and a background in political economics, electronic media, and Latin American studies fuel her ongoing explorations of new media art as advocacy as a powerful educational tool. As I said, there's more about Liz in the chat. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Liz, and I'll just let you take it away, Liz.
Tom, thank you so much. And I just want to emphasize what a pleasure it is to be in your company, whether it is virtual or physical. You look as strange as anyone could imagine. You almost look like you're, I don't know, wading through the swamp or something. But yeah, I do want to take a moment and just appreciate FLEFF for all of the work you've been doing to convene us and bring us together in this moment. FLEFF is a highlight experience for me because of the way that you so beautifully merge intellectual conversations with immersive media, such beautiful curation. So thanks to you and Patty. It's just such an honor to be a part of this. And I also wanted to do a short acknowledgement. I am personally coming to you from the unceded lands of the Ganyangahaga Nation, which is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which I live, teach, create, and learn. Some people know where I live as Montreal. And today we're hosting this encounter, this virtual encounter on Zoom. And I just want to mention that Zoom's headquarters are located on the Muwekma Alone territory, which is otherwise known as San Jose, California. And I'd like to suggest that Zoom is a platform which both alienates and connects us from the aims of restitution, justice, and reparation. And I do that acknowledgement because we're in the midst of quite an interesting moment in Montreal and in Canada, moreover, of really trying to grapple with our colonial settler identities in new ways. I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland, but have now been in Montreal for 17 years. And I do see this as a sort of a moment where we're being invited to step up to the challenges of dealing with our past in new and creative ways. And so I'll just say that's kind of a way that I can introduce a few of my interests in the project SWAMPSCAPES. I will share my screen with you. What I'm hoping to do today is to do a brief overview of the project, but also talk about some of the issues around VR, immersive media, and the environment more broadly. And I'm super excited about some of the people that I can see who've already joined today. So I hope this will be as much a dialogue as anything else. But I will start with just a bit of an orientation. And so to do that, I will share my screen. Just a second. No, sorry about that. Let's just try that one more time. Here we go. You would think I haven't been teaching for the last year and a half. So SWAMPSCAPES was an initiative that I began 2 years ago precisely with two collaborators who are not with me today, but who are frequently with me in many other contexts, Juan Carlos Zaldivar and Kim Grinfeeder. Kim is in charge of interactive media at the University of Miami, and Juan Carlos Zaldivar is a multimedia artist with a tremendous experience. He had way more experience in 360 film when we began. And there were a bunch of questions that I had when I was entering this initiative. I had been working for several years on a project called The Shoreline, where I was focusing my attention on shoreline communities and the impact of rising sea levels. And what I discovered along the way was the power of swamps. And when I went to the University of Miami for a research position, I knew that I wanted to spend time in the Everglades. And it wasn't until I met Kim who mentioned that in addition to doing some form of an interactive documentary, we might think about the place of using VR to communicate some of the goals that we were hoping to do, which was to really bring about a kind of deeper awareness of the role of swamps in our communities. There's a sort of byline that I use is before there were cities, there were swamps. And many of us know that most of our cities were built on swamps. And most of the way we see swamps is, you know, in horror films or connected to mosquitoes, or we often have negative associations with swamps. So we really wanted to use this project to kind of push away from those stereotypes. But I also had a series of questions. Once Kim kind of invited me to think alongside with him about the possible uses of VR, I then had a series of questions that came up, questions that I'm deeply committed to around issues of power. Like, if we did this project, who would have access to VR? And what are the values that have accompanied this medium? And might we and my own goals merge with that? I wanted to understand the emergent ethical frameworks in VR. I wanted to sort of think together about the immersive storytelling possibilities, and whether they might subvert, rather reinscribe power inequities. I know a lot of us have heard about the hype of being there or the empathy claims, but I really wanted to push back against that and be thinking about the ethics of what it means to be on other people's territories and teleporting other places. I wanted to think about the environmental considerations of VR. I know many people who are here today have thought about that. Should we be circulating all these plastic headsets all over the world, and what are the implications of that? Is it any better than actually getting in airplanes and flying to these places? And what new forms of documentary and visual tropes might we discover through this project? And so let me just introduce you, do a short little tour of Swampscapes. Going to back up here. I personally always like, I think a lot of times when we go to a website, there's a lot there. And so I thought I would just show you from my perspectives what is here. I shared with you the 3 directors that were a part of creating this, but I did not share with you the 30 students who had a hand in this. And I will just say that this website, the first version of it, was built by students at the University of Miami. And I'll just guide you through it. So we got to and had to think together about not only the content that we wanted to share about the swamp and how we wanted to restory the way people think about swamps and their vital importance, not simply in Miami, but all over the world. Some of you may know that there is a $15 billion price tag on bringing back the swamp, the restoration project of the Everglades. So there's this tension between building over the swamps, but also now, as we see the rise of rising sea levels and climate change risks, now the price of restoring our swamps is high. And people around the world are looking at the Everglades as kind of a case study, particularly people from places like China, where there's still so much development. They're really kind of trying to understand what they're doing in Miami. So we saw it as a kind of a case study to really think about how do we communicate about swamps, and how do we communicate about climate change more broadly. So here we chose 6 people through which we wanted to kind of tell the story of the swamps. And when Kim invited me to come along on this experience of creating an immersive VR piece, I was very excited to try it out, but I was also insistent that we also have a 2D version of the film, of the experience. And what I realized was that these would be very different experiences. So this is all the material that is also in the VR, but it's different because the way you shoot for a VR film is entirely different than the way you shoot for what is sometimes known as a flatty or a 2D piece. And so we have these 6 different individuals, and that was a very intentional decision, which was pushing back against this idea of being teleported to a place without a personal welcome. So while the notion of the guide is something that's very important in tourism, and you pay a lot of money to have a guide, I wanted to think about this concept of a guide, moreover about the ethics of how we enter land and territories. And so in each virtual space, there is a person who kind of welcomes you there. And we thought carefully about who those individuals should be. So we have a mix of scientists and a spiritualist and an artist and a local resident. And so that was all sort of important to us. We also, so here we have the films, and there is, for each site, there's a 360 landscape, which I will not necessarily go through. And there's also a map of exactly where the space is. And you can really see the sort of territory of the Everglades National Park. It's enormous. But in addition to using these moving images, I was also really interested in the sounds of the Everglades. And I initially had this idea of creating this swamp symphony. And it was, I knew that the University of Miami had a really strong music school. So I had spent some time trying to make some contacts with some professors there. And it turned out that the vision that I had for the project didn't quite happen. But what did happen was that I encountered, I began doing research about scientists who use sounds as their primary method of research. And I reached out to them and said, would you be able to donate these sounds to a class who's thinking about interactivity and installation online? And we turned these sounds that have been collected over the years from researchers into this swamp symphony, where you can sort of bring these sounds together and really begin to think about like biodiversity. So in addition to the films, the 360, we were really thinking about sound as an immersive means to bring people closer to the Everglades. And I don't want to go on too far because I know that it's really easy to experience fatigue in Zoom, but I also wanted to just quickly kind of mention what we've done with this project over the last year and a half. From the beginning, anybody who I know, and I know many of you who are in this environment, but I don't know everybody, I'm first and foremost, as I was mentioning before, from both an ethical but also a site of inquiry, I'm super interested in multi-platform. So I'm really interested in how an installation might be a bit different than a VR piece, than a website, and thinking about how these different platforms communicate the swamp differently. So as I mentioned, we had the Swamp Symphony, and we had the 2D version. We created a study guide, and we did a few pilots of thinking about audience engagement. Like I was learning about 360 and VR along the way. And so one of the early pilots that we did was this was all pre-COVID, of course, but we took the project to the Smithsonian Museum and set it up. It was almost like an ad hoc setup, and we had 300 visitors, 350 visitors in one day. And we just began to see like what was the potential for this new medium, new to us, new to me in particular, not new to gamers, not new to many people, but certainly new to me. And certainly new to me in thinking about the potential for advocacy. And when I say advocacy, I'm really thinking mostly about this idea of what I'm calling swamp literacy. So coming to understand swamps in a way that's beyond those stereotypes that I mentioned earlier. We also, of course, were sort of learning alongside many of the film festivals. That's what Tom and Patty and I were going to try to do, was to bring this medium to FLEFF and kind of understand how audiences would interact. So we were doing that with a couple different film festivals, and sometimes we were pitching the idea of doing installations alongside the festivals, so taking a room. We did that in Miami. But we were also taking this to schools, and we began thinking and working with a few science teachers in Miami. just to begin to understand how students would be responding to this. I was speaking about platforms, and in addition to these other versions of the headset, we also did this interactive dance installation. I'm just going to play you a second of that because it's really kind of fun. So in that piece, we actually took dancers with us on one of our guided tours through the swamp, and then came back, and we're really thinking about like, how can we think about interactivity in a more space based concept rather than simply the interactivity through a headset. And as I was mentioning earlier, just because I have the slide here, I'll just sort of say that in the VR there are 7 landscapes and 7 guides. In the 2D version there are 6. But we tried to connect each of the characters to a topic and really think through the swamp with them. What are different modes of knowledge in this site? And I was also talking about, thinking alongside with all of these collaborators, what we might achieve by using these multiple platforms. And we really wanted to foreground students in particular and educators through visits to museums, through classrooms, and through festivals when we could. And what was really important for us was thinking about how we might use VR within the frame of environmental justice, and really be thinking about these kind of ethical and aesthetic frameworks. So thinking about VR and climate advocacy, we were kind of framing this around 3 areas. Like, one, how is VR a unique way to tell a place-based story? Be it a story about space, be it a story about gentrification. But how might we really move from the immersive experience into the critical dialogue? We knew that we were using the novelty of the medium, that it's hardly novel today, but we knew we were thinking about that, and we wanted to push that argument of the empathy machine beyond that sort of first generation of like, oh, this is so amazing, into how can we literally move from empathy to action in any forms, action even in like taking the headset off and thinking about the swamps in people's backyards. And there were several challenges in thinking about climate advocacy. As many of us know, the VR headset is still a wonky experience and made even more inaccessible with COVID, and more accessible and less accessible. More accessible if you buy your own headset and you're using it from home, less accessible if you wanted to go to a museum or an art center and experience it as part of an installation. We realized there's very few models to use VR in strategic environmental advocacy. The one that we researched the most has been the one of taking it to a decision maker at the World Forum, or let's say to any kind of policymaker, and having them put the headset on, have this emotive experience, and then be able to discuss. But this idea of taking it to schools has been an ongoing challenge for us. We've had actually tremendous success during COVID because we decided to make the project free for lots of audiences. So I should say that the website is available and free to anybody who wants to download it. But there have been obviously a lot of challenges in our advocacy plan. So I'm going to pause and I can dig back into this project with any questions, but that was sort of an overview of these kind of 2 pivot areas I wanted to share, which was this idea of, can VR or immersive media be a tool for environmental advocacy? And also, how do we use this multi-platform approach to address the kind of multi-literacies that we need to be thinking about environmental issues in these times. So
What do you think?
what do you think?
How can you?
Thanks, Tom.
They think that VR does have a useful role in environmental advocacy?
I raced through those slides, so again, I'm really happy to go back in.
Did you show one of the films?
Yeah, sure. Would that be helpful?
There's the one where the guy that's fishing. I kind of like that.
You know what? That's the extra cred that you get. You're asking like for the Cracker Jacks Award, you know, like you actually have to dig into the project, and the project is available online, free for download for anybody. But it's what Tom is referring to is it's the very last segment that's not available on the website, and it's about a guy who has been fishing in this fishing hole in the Everglades for probably 30 years. And each time we would go in with the biologists, we'd pass by these local fishermen. And so on one occasion, we stopped and just spent the whole day with him talking about his strategy of how to share a fishing hole with an alligator. So a lot of what we were trying to do in this project was think about the positionality of the user. So have the camera be in between you and the alligator, or you and the fisher person, or you and something else, so that you were really feeling sort of this tension between species, or this tension between place and person. And I think Patty's like far more eloquent than I am about this project, but also has mentioned to me about conversations she had with some of her students about this idea of different attunements to the environment, and how just the possibility of being in this space in between these elements kind of wakes us up to certain sensitivity of the place, but without kind of trespassing in that place. So there you go, Tom. No, I'm not going to share that film because it's not. You have to download. There you go. There's my commercial to after this to download the project and try it out on a headset, or on the headset of somebody that you know.
Well, let me ask a slightly different question. You know, there's been a lot of attention to the Everglades in the last year, hasn't there? As a political issue in Florida.
Yeah.
Could you say something about that?
About the politics of Florida, in particular with reference to the Everglades.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I mean the Everglades, as I was saying before, the idea of, I mean, every engineer or environmental expert that we spoke to said, you know, you can move a port, you can do massive change in an environment, but bringing back a swamp is actually really challenging, which is why this price tag of $15 billion to restore the swamp. And there's a lot of, as we know, Miami, all we have to do is look towards Miami and we see like every imaginable political struggle playing itself out. But in particular with the Everglades, there's the tension of all these different users. So it gets into this question of land use. So you have, like, some people worry that the next stage of the Everglades is an expansion of agriculture. Other people worry that it's an expansion of condominiums. Other people are, you know, behind the restoration effect. So you have all of the tensions that you have in almost any environmental site playing out in the Everglades. But you have kind of the world watching the Everglades. Theorists call it the hyper object. It's sort of a stand-in for all of these larger issues. So it's also, you know, the number of tourists who move through Miami, but also in particular who move through the Everglades is sort of interesting. So it has a lot of tensions playing out. I don't know if anybody in the room has been to the Everglades. I have to say.
Can I ask that? Anybody been to the Everglades? No. No. What do you hear?
We have this super cliche thing that we've been using, which is
Martin Lucas has this hand raised.
The super cliche concept that we've been using, which is like, you know, thinking about this as a field trip. So the alternative field trip to the Everglades. And I invite people to try it out and see if it actually does feel that way. Again, I feel that at this moment in time, we're kind of exploring the novelty. It is still novel to some of us of VR versus the experience, and by no means is a headset ever a stand-in for another experience. But here in Montreal, we're grappling with a lot of issues like critical mobility, disabilities. So we were also sort of interested in how do you use VR to address issues of access. And, you know, especially for a place like a swamp, which, for one, we shouldn't all be perhaps we shouldn't all be, you know, moving through these kind of fragile environments, but also some of us would not be able to move through those environments. So that was another really big consideration that we were thinking through about the potential of the medium.
I guess to answer your question about VR, I think it's like, especially with what you're working with, something that like really benefits from like a full like 360 view of like just like a visual standpoint. I think it's really good because I know a lot of just a lot of things involved in nature, like zoos and like different reserves have like the same sort of thing. I guess the only thing I would say is that because everyone has it now, it's not new anymore. And if it's not implemented in a cool way, it can kind of come off as gimmicky and kind of as an add-on. I guess like as long as it's implemented in a unique way that other people aren't implementing it, like, I guess.
It sounds like you've had some experience with VR.
Yeah, they brought VR headsets to the school for us to use for like different activities, and I wasn't involved in it, but I know there was like people involved in coding learned how to code with VR too as well.
You know, and Christian, the issue you raise of I like to think about it as like what happens before you put the headset on and what happens right after you put the headset on. Like, is there an environment that's created, you know, that is particular, and what is the dialogue that we intentionally prompt? What is the class dialogue, or what is the museum dialogue? I agree with you. I mean, when we were sort of casting for science museums to see like where we really would have loved for this project to end up if they hadn't all closed, we were looking critically at you know, at science museums and how they are communicating a lot of these issues, and what's not being communicated, you know, in terms of issues around, like, let's say, environmental racism, or the intersection of spirituality, or the untold stories or the less told stories in places like the Everglades, you know, for example, like Indigenous peoples who hid during the colonial period. So I think you're absolutely right. It's sort of like, it's all the context around that headset that we're learning. We're really learning, because I think, you know, folks like FLEFF figured it out in terms of how to make a cinematic experience, a dialectic experience, you know, through what happens before and after. But I think figuring that out in VR is really quite different. So I really appreciate your comment.
Yeah, some other comments or questions in the chat, or just, oh, got two raised hands. I got a lot of experience here, so. Who is it? Doing several screens. Why don't you just, you got your hand raised, why don't you just shout it out?
Anna, do you want to ask a question? Is that what you're?
You see, okay. You go.
Yeah.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Liz. Hi. Greetings from Germany. Yes, I was wondering about one idea you shortly touched upon, which is co-creation, and the idea of doing things together with people, for people. And I got the impression that it's not only people you are doing things with, but more or less the swamps themselves. Could one say that co-creation is in this project kind of enlarged and extended to some agents that so far have not been in the focus of co-creation theory?
I would love to say that. Anna, I would love to share this hilarious thing that would happen when we were in the swamp. As anybody who knows who's shot with these cameras, if you don't want to be, because it's the 360 sphere, right? The camera is everywhere. So the idea is you have to go hide somewhere. And hiding somewhere in a swamp can be a little tiny bit of a frightening thing. Because you don't want to step in the wrong area. You don't want to lose the microphones. You know, I would be positioning microphones all in these wet areas. But so we would put the camera on, and then we would push play, and then we would all go hide behind these beautiful cypress trees, and then we'd wait. And so you'd be standing right up against a tree, and it was this unexpected, like, sensorial experience for me, where I had nothing to do with the filming. I was standing with and behind a tree rather than kind of mitigating, you know, using my camera to mitigate this experience. So I think there are new collaborators, right? There's the camera that's really doing the work. There is the environment that when we became so quiet as we were hiding behind these huge cypress trees, you know, would come alive differently than when we were chatting or talking or doing interviewing. So there was definitely a very different experience of being tuned in to all of the different elements in the frame, in that scenario. So I think there are some possibilities here for thinking about co-creation in different ways. And I know Patty has also sort of alerted me to that kind of notion of thinking about co-creation in that way.
Maybe you should explain what co-creation is, because I don't think my students really have a sense of it.
What is co-creation?
Co-creation to a non-film study.
Right. So Anna, do you want to tackle that, or should I? I will, just for time's sake. Okay, so co-creation is a term that many of us use, which is like collaboration. And thinking about how we can move away from the sort of auteur mode of cinema, which really kind of channels our vision towards one person in one particular role, that of the director, towards all of the people or elements who come together in the creation of a film. And Anna's sort of bringing forth this idea of like really making it more evident that yes, the environment was there, you know, and we were interacting with that environment as a co-creator. I hope that's clear enough. And Patty has put a great article that has like some fabulous Q&As about what is co-creation. But it's both a practice of collaboration for people like myself who love to work in the company of others, but it's also kind of a political stance against the authorship, or a way of rethinking the way we've approached media making.
Okay, we got Colin with a question. Colin, you want to ask your question?
Yes, I do. Hi, I'm Colin, and I think my the question I wanted to ask was, you know, as a film, you know, maker and director, where do you find yourself like struggling the most with this, you know, adding this VR element to your live documentary? Like, did you have to think differently as a director, or just to like get into this headspace of, you know, like this is a much, you know, very different towards your casual documentary?
Yeah, thank you, Colin. So I had to entirely rethink. I mean, the rhetoric of using VR is totally different than 2D or, you know, the flatty. And so there was, for one, attention can be everywhere. And so you have to think about the choreography of how you are or are not directing attention in the frame. And part of why we use as I was saying, the idea of the guide was both political, but it was also narrative based. This idea of having people in the frame sort of point out things for you, like look up. We went, for example, to an environment after a fire, and we had a ecologist whose expertise is in disaster. So he kind of understands, like he goes to places after a fire or something. And so he was sort of pointing out all of these intricacies that we might not have noticed on our own, above, below. Or we had an indigenous spiritualist who sort of walked us in 4 different directions. And so you're really thinking a lot more about choreography in space, which is also why we wanted to work with dancers. And so we were working a lot with dancers, and a lot of it didn't end up in this particular form because it was just too much. But choreography got me thinking about, well, how far can we take this? And what are natural choreographies, and what are rehearsed choreographies, and how do guides choreograph our gaze, and that's and our attention, right? Because it really is about choreographing attention. But yeah, so part of what I love as a maker is right now I'm working with augmented reality, because I think there's something I like about trying to understand the emergent rhetorics of how we communicate through these technologies. And so I really did like thinking about it's entirely different, I think.
What's augmented reality?
So for me, augmented there's many different forms of augmented reality, but basically it's like using an app on your phone to augment the spaces that you visit. I'll kind of I'm so excited about this project, but I'll briefly share with you the project that I'm working on right now that's called SWAMPSCAPES. And basically this was a COVID project where a group of us mapped out different wastegapes throughout the city. And when you arrive at a wastecape, it is augmented. Let me sort of go here. Augmented with information and layers of the history that came before. So this, for example, is a park in Montreal that was once a quarry, then became a landfill, and is now turned into an alternative energy park, where they're both dealing with methane that they're then translating into biogas, but they're also trying to understand how to mitigate the toxic environment so that people like myself can go and cross-country ski or experience it. So thinking about using augmented reality, this is the app. It just premiered about 6 days ago. We curated these different tours through the city based on kind of themes like food, dirt, scale, waste values, leftovers. So really thinking about what is not visible in an environment and how you could use a locative media tool to augment your understanding through sound, through image, through text.
How did you define a wastegate? What came under the umbrella?
Well, this is where you have to come to Montreal and help us define that.
You went for Buffalo. You really.
I love the idea of just keeping it so obviously everything I do has this sort of sequence, from the shoreline to the to the idea of putting different landscapes in conversation. So Patty writes and thinks a lot about polyvocalization and how do we understand these different wastegapes when we make these critical connections? And Tom, you're an avid cyclist. What happens if this is a cycling tour, but also a walking tour? But what happens if I ask you to move from site to site? Like, what kind of knowledge can we understand about people's proximity to wastegapes? And we're seeing wastegapes from anything from the petrochemical industry that's in the eastern part of the city to like a refurbished sculpture garden made of like old waste, to these unclaimed or these reclaimed areas by local residents. So really thinking broadly about wastegapes.
Yeah, it's like the unrecognized history of the place, right?
Yeah.
And ignored. And yeah, I love that idea.
And what's interesting is that the stories have just gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. So actually, I guess, most of the shorts in SWAMPSCAPES were about 2 minutes. And the same is true for these audio stories that you get on the Wastegapes tour. It's about 2 minutes. So that's another tension. It's like, what is the short narrative unit that is long enough and yet provocative enough that invites us to ask questions about our local environments.
Okay, well, Jade, you got a question. You had a question for a while, so. Go for it.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Liz, you've talked about the restoration of swamps and swampscapes, and I was like, I'm not very well read on the importance of swamps. So I was just wondering if you could sort of explain why maintenance of swamps aren't necessarily enough, and like what would the restoration of these landscapes entail? Like, why is it so much money, basically, is what I'm.
Thank you, Jade, by the way. You know, sometimes we forget to say the very obvious things when we're talking. And like, first of all, what is swamp literacy? I kind of threw that term out without even getting close to what I meant by that. But swamps are areas that foster biodiversity. They also take in a lot of the methane and carbon in our environment. And they are home to a lot, like they're places where a lot of things grow. So we need swamps also to buffer us from incoming storms. So, you know, like in a city where there's just a ton of concrete, swamps and parks are places that buffer the impact of rising sea levels. So just to reminded me that I kind of forgot to tell you what I meant by swamp literacy or why they're even important. You know, actually the miracle is that we ever learned how to build on swamps, because swamps are just like very, very complicated, because they're like, when I went through walked through the swamp, they do these swamp walks in Miami, you can easily sink like, you know, a foot, like from moment to moment. And so it's very uneven uneven. And so it's hard to build on that. And in order to build on that, they had to just put in a ton of concrete and like fill it in with a lot of things. And so the advantage of not filling in our swamp with concrete is to maintain these more flexible, fluid environments that will be more adaptive to a rapidly changing environment. I hope that kind of helps a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, Jade, the hilarious thing is that as a documentary maker, you're always like so partially understand the issue that you're dealing with, and the further you get into the issue, the more you realize you don't even know what you're talking about. But you know, I guess our craft is sort of condensing very complex things into slightly more decipherable concepts. But you know, if there is a biologist in the room, they should stand up and correct me on anything I'm saying.
Other questions? I'll ask a question. Could you say something? You talked about climate change in your presentation. So could you just talk a little bit about the connection between the Everglades specifically, or just swamps in general, and climate change, what the issues are?
Yeah. So basically, again, when we look at Miami, we see all of these people spending millions of dollars pumping water because it was built on a swamp, like many cities around the world. And it's not in a situation to accommodate rising sea levels. So, you know, when you have a huge storm in a city and all the water doesn't know where to go because everything is concrete, the same is true for rising sea levels. Swamps mitigate against the intensity of oncoming storms. And what we've seen in the last 15 years, but very acutely in the last 5 years, is some of the areas that are most vulnerable to erratic storms. So that's sort of one front. The other front is the role that swamps play in capturing carbon. And so that's seriously important, almost as important as like the Amazon in terms of the lungs of our planet. So those are two of the really important, and also I guess it's just sort of that literacy of when we urbanize, you know, what are the tensions there? So what are we, again, it was through engineers that explained to me, you can move a port, you can engineer your way through with concrete easier than you can re-engineer a swamp. There is no re-engineering a swamp. It's maybe that, Jade, was your question. It's like, it's just impossible to bring back that fragility of biodiversity. Like if there was one thing that we really wanted this project to communicate was the biodiversity. What does it mean? And how can we sort of also open up and expand that conversation? Why is that so
Like a
important?
rainforest, right?
I would say the swamp is precisely like a rainforest. Yeah. Like in terms of there are things in the swamps that are thousands of years old, things, trees, primarily ferns, but there are also there's a fragility and an interactivity that is really the essence of how our planet works.
But also, it's really not recognized the same way the rainforests are, right?
Oh no, not at all. Because
That's
it's
why your
buggy.
project is like important. Right?
Exactly. You say the rainforest, and everyone's like, yes, right. But you say like the swamp, and you're like, I mean, because really, if you after this presentation go ask anybody in your community about like where are the swamps in our community, they are there. The idea was really like part of our dream was that we would have school students from all over the world kind of sending us their local swamp images. I'm going to start a project once COVID is done with city officials in this city who are trying to protect our local swamps. There's swamps everywhere. Mud.
Agnes?
Oh, hi. Yeah, so kind of going off of what you just said, you talked about how like complicated these ideas can be and how complicated it is to kind of organize your thoughts on, this massive situation. So as a filmmaker, I'm wondering how, like through your process, how do you prioritize which elements of the situation to communicate to the public, especially because, swamps aren't as, most people don't know as much about swamps as they do about like something like the rainforest, which you just touched on. So how do you prioritize that?
Agnes, thank you for asking that question. It's a really, really important question. And I want to link it back to what we talked about, the theme of co-creation. So one of the values in co-creation is a lot of dialogue and consultation. And so like when I met with the biologist, Larry, who's an algae expert, and we did this whole sequencing underwater with him. If you can imagine, we had conversations for over a week, right, about his research and his practice. And then I had to condense that into 2 minutes. And a part of my value as a maker is to then take it back to him, vet it with him, and say, what do you think? And, he didn't think I had done such a great job. He thought that I needed to give a lot more context and information. But what I was learning is that is not the mode in VR. Like part of the experience of VR is to be in a place, not be being talked at in a place, which is to give the user room to explore, to sense, to feel. And so we had a really interesting, exciting tug of war about how how minimal we could get the information down to. And I think, Agnes, that's just like always a tension. And I think you always end up feeling like you've come short in terms of offering just enough context so that viewers want to learn more, but it may not all happen in the film you've made. And so that sort of tension of information context versus aesthetics and openness and visual storytelling, I think is kind of the reason I stay in it, because it's so unresolved in me.
Thank you.
Martin, you got a question?
Yeah, hi, Liz. I was wondering, though, based on that, if you would do it again. I mean, the use of VR just as a platform, given all the other things you have a website, you've got still imagery, you've got regular time-based media. Did it play out the way you wanted? Does it have enough value added for you as a way of getting people involved with swamps?
Hi, Marty, by the way. I'm so happy to see you, and thank you for asking the question. I feel like I'm on the fence about this. And Montreal is a hub for VR, and it's also a hub for AR, augmented reality. And so there's a lot of exciting work that people are doing that is, especially, for example, in space. Like we have a really interesting company in Montreal that is really working with astronauts and really exploiting this idea of spaces that we will never get to, and how can we make those spaces more accessible. So I think if a project with the right question comes to mind, yes, I would use it again. Like I'm thinking about working on pushing this idea of trash. I'll probably stay with this trash for a couple years, or waste. And there's a lot of waste sites that people just would be, hello, I created this biking tour to go to waste sites, but it's not the idea. It's not like, yeah, let's go. So I think if the thematic is something that really people don't want to go to, but the medium is an interesting way to take you there, I think I would consider it again. But I would never consider it alone. If there's anything I've learned, it's like it's got to be one of many. Especially with VR, like look at COVID. Okay, so they said that during COVID, a lot of young people, the gaming industry has like exploded. A lot of VR has exploded, but in these very niche communities, So if you're really going for multiple audiences, I think you just cannot limit yourself just to the VR. That was my feeling. But it is also right before COVID. I felt like we were on this moment of like the headset was transitioning into a room, and I really felt like a lot of biologists, for example, have been thinking in domes and really thinking about VR. VR is opening our imagination to spaces that we can create. So I think it's opening. It goes back to the other question about the rhetoric of the medium. I think at this moment that's sort of as important for me as learning how to use that medium for the right story.
Let me just, Trish Fitz, I'm gonna go back to you, Trish. You had an awesome.
Can you hear me there?
Trish.
Hi. It's 6 a.m. in the morning here.
Yeah, so I'm gonna get
so
out.
forgive my state of semi-undress, but I want to talk, Liz. In my work around swamps and wetlands, balancing creating a sense of beauty for the viewer, letting them see how precious that landscape is, whilst at the same time taking them into an awareness of indeed how swamps have been used as rubbish tips and so on, is a dynamic balance that I'm constantly working with. I so look forward to seeing this work, and I hooked in a bit late, but could you talk about that balance in your work, please?
The balance of kind of authentic representation of a place. Is that what you mean?
Yes, I guess so. Yeah. How, because as you say, like so many of us, I was brought up to really appreciate the Australian environment, but not swamps. Mangroves were kind of smelly, dirty places. So getting people to really see and understand the beauty of that ecosystem, whilst at the same time, indeed being authentic to the ways in which they've been despoiled. Yeah, that feels like sometimes a tension, certainly an active balance in my work. I'd like your reflections on how you manage that.
Well, okay, so to be totally honest, I would say that the VR was not a place where we were pushing a lot of those tensions, because if you go through the experience, it's a little glamorized in a sense. Like it seems like it's not glamorized, but it might seem like it's easier to be there or get there than it is. So, there's like in Florida, there's 6 weeks where you would even want to be anywhere near that area, because it's humid and it's buggy and it's full of snakes and there's crocodiles, a block away. So it isn't an environment that many of us should be in that often, and we certainly shouldn't be there without a guide. And so I think that this goes back to that question of how much context are you offering, in a piece, and that's why I always feel like the website, like we have a lot of educational materials, because I don't know that I feel like the VR, that immersive place-based thing, it is literally like a taste of something, but certainly not anything complete or comprehensive. But yeah, the very complicated notion of who's, as we were saying before, from human, like who's had to hide in swamps, to who to the sort of more complicated being in these places, the smells, the bugs, is something that I don't know if that would really come across in Swampscapes. Moreover, what we were trying to do was invite you into a new inquiry, and really just sort of disrupt this idea of them as strictly, maybe we tip the balance too far on the other side of like, I'd be curious what you would say, but maybe it's a bit romanticized, like this guy fishing in a thing that is kind of dangerous. Like if anybody I knew did that, I would be like, what are you doing? But
dangerous because of sharks, or dangerous
well, the
because of
alligators.
toxicity?
Yeah, I mean the alligator. I mean, he's literally like he's fishing in the same, like in the VR. There's an alligator on one side and a fisher person on the other, and it's not that big of a space in between them. So I think we were moreover pointed to the tensions of other inhabitants and assumptions, but maybe a little bit less the sort of more complicated ideas of that you're pointing to, which I think comes out in longer dialogues and deeper literacies.
Can I very cheekily, Chair, ask one more separate question, or should I put up my hand and wait?
Oh, no, you go ahead.
I recently saw Lynette Walworth's fabulous VR called Collisions, about the Maralinga trials that the British government undertook in the Australian desert in the 1950s, which is a shameful chapter, but leaving that aside, what I loved about Collisions is the way that she combined elements of a I love lots of things about it, but elements of a historical narrative within a VR experience of being there. Now, I've not seen your Swampscapes, but is that a dimension you're interested in
Yes,
exploring?
And first of all, I love Collisions also, and I recommend it to anybody here. It's one of it was one of the early favorite pieces that I saw because of its complexity of really unveiling a history that had not been told, and it had a very clear voice to it that wasn't simply about just being in a place. You were being in a place through a particular individual who had lived something, and an Indigenous person as well. So with this, we were really working more around the polyvocal context. So there's 7 different voices, 7 different entryways, but each of them have their expertise, have an entryway. So Houston, for example, his family has been in that region for a while, and he is an Indigenous artist whose family owns one of the tree islands in the Everglades, and he sort of refers to that, but briefly, in what you can do in 2 minutes. But at least it points to the fact of who has inhabited this land before. Betty, who is another Indigenous water activist, points to what it is to live in a region where all this spill off from the agriculture is moving into the water. And so she's been a super activist around, speaking to that. So people point to either local contemporary issues or also point to more historical concerns, but not in the same one experience way that I think Collisions does. Yeah. So
So again, it seems like it's the interaction between the web and the VR is vital to
Yes,
to
yes.
how your work realizes.
Yes, yeah,
those
there's different
different
layers.
aims.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Each
Yeah.
space gives you kind of a different context.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, nice to see you, Trish.
Lovely to see you.
And Michelle's got a question. I'll make sure we get to her. And
Hi, Liz.
Hi,
Annie. Listen, it's so great to be able to go to a swamp without the bugs, you know, or the alligators. And it just occurs to me that here you've done a beautiful job, as usual, of really bringing us into an amazing space. And you're using a technology that's really been pretty much in the realm of gamers and entertainment, right? And those industries are much bigger than academia and much bigger than science centers. So in order to get environmental messaging out of, you know, where it's been holed up and away from just the clutches of people who already care, you know, and want to learn about, you know, the importance of ecosystem services in a swamp and all of that important biology, why not somehow connect more with those much bigger audiences and influencers with this kind of beautiful capture? You know, I think back to things like, 100 years ago, we played this game called Sim City, which was a really early, you know that one? Really early kind of simulation, right, of urban planning. It was kind of like learning business by playing Monopoly, or, you know, you can really learn true things if you play, right? So I'm wondering if there's a playfulness within the gaming entertainment world that could co-create, which would, I think, you know, exponentially increase the audience and the people who might see this work.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that, Annie, because I feel like a lot of climate activists and educators are getting the fact that the gaming is really a space that we have to take extremely seriously, and think about, is there a way to be in that space in different ways? And I feel like for me, VR was as close as I'd come to gaming. Like I haven't, especially like thinking through the rhetoric of interactivity, which of course we didn't talk about. You know, we talked about like 360, but interactivity within that realm is a whole other rhetoric to learn. It's not just about directing attention, it's about like triggering events, triggering things. So I think that what 360 does is sort of open people like myself to begin to learn the language, to begin to think through the potential for the spaces that you're speaking to. Because it is a jump. It's a jump to move from the way I thought and made work before to working in this realm. But I agree with you. I think that we're kind of missing a really big opportunity to communicate by not being in the gaming world. But for me, it's still a huge stretch, you know, to get there.
Right.
We're gonna have to wrap it up momentarily.
Just a question of getting the right partners, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Thank
Do
you.
you have any final thoughts, Liz? Maybe for students in the audience that are interested in these topics?
My last thoughts are my last thoughts are just like to think about what is really honestly the media that impacts you the most. Like, is it on what platform is it, and how can we, you know, one of the things I really think about is the generational divide at this moment in terms of like what someone like myself is making versus what people are around the world are using. And I think there's very important dialogues that we have to have about this intersection between environmental education or environmental ethics, environmental issues, media platforms, and user habits and user trends, and how we're changing. We're changing pretty quickly, but also like how do we build in? This feels so important to me right now, having gone through this year in COVID. Is how do we really make projects that also invite people outside, invite people to engage with their local environments beyond media, like invite them to get, that's why I'm so excited about this Wastegapes thing, because I'm feeling the need to like leave my computer for a while and just be in my environment and be learning and listening in that way.
Well, you've made me more interested in swamps than I was before we haven't started this class. So one final question. Are there like really good books on swamps that you recommend?
So many, oh my gosh. Oh, I wish I knew that.
Why don't you email me a list, okay?
Okay, yes, because that's such a great question. There's so many amazing fiction and academics. So yeah, I would love for anybody who wants to know more about swamps and how they've been depicted across literature. I would love to share that.
And also, are there just like studies of swamps that are like environmental studies, like of the rainforest or?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of the the issue of like endangered species, right? Like polar bears are very like, protected because everybody cares about them, but the snail darter or some other, less sort of attractive species doesn't get as much attention, right?
It's so
swamps are kind of like that, right?
Yeah, mosquitoes. Well, actually, there's even some new books on mosquitoes, but like mosquitoes don't get the same. They really don't get the same call as polar bears. I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Liz. It was great to have you in our class, and we're asking everybody to, at the end here, to put your microphones on and show yourselves on the screen if possible. And we're going to give Liz a great big round of applause. All right.
Thank you so much for all these new individuals I'm meeting, but also friends that have turned up today. It's really just always such a privilege, whether it's in person or through Zoom, to be with the FLEFF community. And I just want to say what a really valuable space you've created here, especially during COVID. Just really helping us stay in touch with each other. And thanks to Julia and all of the folks and Annie, all the people behind the scenes who are making this particular FLEFF happen. So thank you.
Come to Ithaca soon.
Yes, exactly. Hi, Phil.
I love you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Okay, Tom, are we going to keep the presenter on the line? And